Oh, thank you so much. Well, what's up? Good morning. Sorry, I was speaking a different language. All right, so my name is Brian Douglas. I go by B Dougie on the internet, and I'm super honored to be here on this stage, delivering a keynote. I've actually been coding professionally for almost 10 years, and it's crazy that this conference has been around for 10 years as well, which we'll get in a bit. But I'm going to talk about insights into open source projects. It's been a passion project for me for a long time. Actually, on this stage, for a 5-minute lightning talk back in 2019, I actually announced this project to a very small room. It was a lightning talk during lunch. But yeah, I've been working on it since and happy to share more. But why I know I've been programming for almost 10 years is because I have a 9-year-old. And my 9-year-old, when he was born 11 weeks early. In the hospital, I learned how to use Ruby on Rails. Ruby on Rails is open source Ruby framework. And always wanted to build an app, add a computer to the house. Actually, no PHP, and did a little bit of Perl, but never saw myself as an engineer or as could get a job in the industry. So super honored to be here because this conference is, I know there's been a lot of partnerships with the local colleges and universities in the area. Shout out to Shaw University. I saw the sign for Shaw on the way in, HBCU, and yeah, just happy to be here. But, oh, sorry, go ahead and clap. Please clap. Yeah, so earlier this year, my son he stayed home from school, and so he's 9 years old, and he was sick, but he really just wanted to play Roblox. So what my wife did is she bought this book, which is about Black inventors, and she made him read the book and do a paragraph on what he learned. And I thought it was a great idea. Honestly, I didn't even think about doing stuff like that. Usually I'm just cool, play Roblox, I've got meetings. But it was just me and him in the house all day, and he went through this book. And super honored that he's super excited to see other folks in the industry that look like me as well. So I'm not the only nerd that he knows in the house. It's funny because in this book they have the Black females who sent the rocket into space. When he learned about that when he was 7 years old, he called them the first Black computers, because he didn't understand computer scientists and the difference. So he's like, oh yeah, the first Black computer sent the rocket into space. And I thought that was really cute. But I bring this up because in that book, there was this guy called Booker T. Washington. A lot of us learned about Booker T. Washington in school during Black History Month. And Booker T. Washington did a lot of really awesome stuff, like the Tuskegee Institute, all this sort of Black businesses that were early at the turn of the century, post antebellum. So I didn't know a lot about this until later, after reading books like this. And Booker T. Washington started one of the first HBCUs in the country in Virginia called Hampton University. This HBCU was specifically set in place for Black individuals post-slavery to get involved in the workforce. So it really just sort of was hospitality, working in the different areas of industry that they were allowed to work in, because that was the ceiling that we had to work through. But what's interesting about this HBCU concept is it gave folks access to integrate in society. And when I look at this room, I see a lot of folks that look like me. I see a lot of folks that don't look like me. And I'm super honored that there's so many other institutions, accelerators, boot camps, that are ushering new faces into the industry. So I just wanted to bring that up because I'm a big fan of open source, and I think open source is a really good gateway into getting more folks in the industry, because there's no barrier. The only barrier is access, and it could be a computer, it could be friendship, it could be a conference, and that's what I've been actually trying to push for since I've joined the industry almost 10 years ago. So I also want to mention All-In. I know they got an award yesterday, but I'm super honored to also be a part of the All-In open source program as well. My former employer at GitHub. Yes, please clap. So my former employer was GitHub. I worked there for 4.5 years on the DevRel team, and I was in the room on conceiving this platform. We did consult with MLH as well to find out how we could teach HBCU students that are doing CS and CE how to do open source, because I think there's a big disconnect. A lot of people don't know that Spelman College, based out of Atlanta, one of the top 10 biggest HBCUs in the country, they don't have their own CS program. Their program is actually gifted to them from Georgia Tech. So there's a lot of distance between access and privilege. and a lot of different colleges. Like North Carolina has one of the biggest HBCUs in the entire country. And like there's so much opportunity here. And like I'd love to see more of all in open source, getting connected to folks like MLH and All Things Open. And just want to shout them out again as well. Cool, so I mentioned I got into programming about 10 years ago. I got my first open source contribution about 2015, so math is hard, 8 years, 7 years. So I didn't know how, I learned Ruby on Rails. I didn't know how to do server-side JavaScript. I had a problem that I was trying to solve where we were trying to include folks into our Slack channel through automation, through our cron, and server-side JavaScript with webhooks was the way that I learned through Stack Overflow to do it. And the challenge I had was I didn't know how to do that. So found a GitHub repo on GitHub. I unfortunately did not know how to use GitHub properly at the time. So instead of opening up a GitHub issue, I emailed the maintainer. And if you're new in open source, probably don't do that. I guess DMs are cool, but emails are awkward. But to my surprise, this maintainer was actually super friendly. It was like a Friday night. I was like, hey, I have to do this thing by Monday. I don't know how to use this thing. Can you help me? And to my surprise, he responded. And the reason he responded throughout the entire weekend was because he was based in Thailand. But when I was working late nights, it was like his normal morning. So I was like, oh, wow, I got lucky on that one. And then he also announced, he's like, hey, I'm glad it worked for you. By the way, I'm actually traveling in Thailand at a K-pop concert. And to my surprise, I had no idea what K-pop was. I didn't know what a digital nomad was as well. Like super brand new, junior in the industry. And from that point on, like I say from stage here, my DMs are always open. Because if someone can actually mentor me and bring me in the industry and do open source with them and show me the ropes, I want to do the same for anybody. So saying right now, DM's open if anyone's getting started. It sounds like it's going to be like $10 per DM pretty soon, thanks to Elon. But until it costs $10, DMs are open. Cool. So these numbers have been shared multiple times throughout this conference. The summary here on this slide is that open source is super valuable for hiring. The number 90% of the demand for open source and talent acquisition it's like off the charts. But the unfortunate reality is most people don't know this is a way to get access in the industry. I worked at GitHub. I know engineers who came through Electron. Electron started at GitHub. And I know college students who contributed to Electron and got a full-time job. And that same college student I'm thinking about is now a staff engineer at GitHub 5 years later because they had access and privilege and opportunity. And what I'm getting at is I didn't really set this slide up well, but I built Open Sauce, which is the project I'm going to talk about in a sec, based on this quote. So Gucci Mane's the godfather of trap music, based out of Atlanta, East Atlanta, Santa. And back in the late 2000s, when I was in college, he had this interview on Tumblr asking about how do you find the sauce. And this is all tongue-in-cheek, but the actual response is actually something that I've been living by when it comes to open source. Because if you don't got sauce, then you lost. And I think there's a lot of folks who don't know what's in the sauce, or don't even know the sauce exists. Like you can get your CS degree, get your degree, become a manager, maybe a founder or whatever. But there's a whole nother opportunity. And PHP being around for so long and getting a word from MLH, that was a gateway for so many new developers to start writing code and start building software and building entire companies like Meta, Facebook. So I bring that up because open source is the thing I'll talk about in a moment. And it really was a self-serve project for me to maintain my own open source. So a CRM tool for me to manage my contributions. And back in 2020, during the pandemic, someone actually reached out and was like, hey, why don't you add a login to this? I'd love to manage my own open source projects as well. And to my surprise, people started signing up for that. So I spent the last couple years sort of bootstrapping, doing this for fun on the side. And I've grown myself as a caricature in the internet, where I'm the Beyonce of open source. And I truly believe this. I know it's tongue-in-cheek, but I think Beyonce has a huge superfan group. And I think if I can help usher in more folks, or maybe even other folks can be Beyoncés of open source, we can usher more folks into the industry through our own special way. Cool, so I started off with this one question: how do I get involved in open source? There's a lot of good guides out there, opensource.guide. I was running a program called Open Source Friday at GitHub for a long time, and there's a lot of really good first steps. But once you find that repository, it's always very confusing on where to start. you don't know who to talk to, you don't know where to make your first contribution. And it's good that we have good first issues, but again, if you don't got the sauce, then you lost. So you got to move past a good first issue. So I enjoy every year during October, there's Hacktoberfest. How many of you did a PR or signed up for Hacktoberfest this year? Cool, a handful of us, which is good. Maybe all are experts in the room, but this is a really good gateway for folks to get the exposure, to even just know open source exists as a platform. Also, this is a great way to learn not to email maintainers, instead open a GitHub issue. So during Hacktoberfest, open source has always been a side project for me. I developed this concept, well, I didn't develop the concept. I actually took this concept from Express. Express.js being a server-side JavaScript, the thing I didn't know how to use. They have this thing called the triage team. And the triage team is really meant to triage issues. It's a painful process. I was talking to Next.js a couple years ago, which is the React meta framework. They were getting 100 issues a day. So just that feat alone to manage all those issues, it's a lot of work. But what if we could train the next level or the next up-and-coming generation to manage the triaging of issues through labeling? This requires opting in folks into the program or into the organization, but also it's a bit of training. So I've got a triage guide inside of my project. I'd encourage you, if you do any sort of triaging and maybe it's overwhelming, invite the next generation to come help you label issues. It sounds super tedious, but I got my teeth cut doing Ruby on Rails and doing CSS and jQuery. Like that seemed tedious once I learned that there was more stuff to do. So someone's got to start somewhere, and I encourage you, look into triage teams. This is a copy of the triage guide. We don't have time to read that. The other thing I do is I started this back in 2018. I had this idea. We got a lot of sort of transient issues open and PRs open inside of our project. Some of them were valid, some of them were invalid or spam. And in order to combat against that, but also train the next generation up, is we created this automation through GitHub Actions to enforce people to link issues. And obviously this is GitHub specific, so obviously take this knowledge to whatever you're using. But we created this GitHub action to force folks to add a linked issue onto your PR. Because it's good to get the code, but if you have no idea why the code exists or who you are or where this came from, I force everyone to open up an issue first. It sounds really tedious, but then it teaches someone how to explain why they wrote the code, where it came from, what they were trying to do. So if you didn't know about this on GitHub, you can link issues just by doing a # and the issue number, and that's enforced through this thing called our PR compliance GitHub action. So shout out to MT Foley, who lives in Raleigh. He's at this event because he's working. But the good thing about this is MT Foley was actually a contributor to open source. So Matt is specifically his first name. He was working on air conditioning software, like super old, archaic software. He had I think maybe he did computer engineering previously, but he wanted to get into web development. But there was no pathway from air conditioning software to web development. And he found open source. Actually, I was on a podcast, and he reached out. He's like, hey, I want to get involved. I was like, oh, cool. I got a good first issue. Mind you, I'll say this once, and I'll move on. The best good first issue is the one you open. A lot of folks always spend all the time trying to find good first issues or trying to find their first contribution. The best thing I can do for someone who wants to contribute to my project is show them how to open that issue and show them how to fix it. Every good first issue in open source has the answer in the issue. It's by default, because I don't think anybody should have to try hard to join a community if it's going to be through contributions or through labeling issues. I want to lower the barrier, because I know what barrier I had to basically get across. Like my first job, I was 27 years old. I'd spent a whole other career working in sales and doing stuff I thought I was supposed to do while I wanted to do full-time engineering. So I just want to make the barrier super, super low for folks. So I go through that, just quick examples, but then I want to talk about these insights, because what I'm working on right now is I want to be able to walk into any project, no matter where it's hosted, and identify, is this a project I can contribute to? So we put together this project starting June. I had left GitHub to work on this full time. And this insights platform, insights.opensauce.pizza, is the actual URL. We built this platform in partnership with DigitalOcean and Hacktoberfest to identify all insights across 527,000 PRs since October 1st. It was a pretty big feat and also very expensive, but luckily DigitalOcean, thank you so much for the free credits. We're now able to identify things like spam, things like acceptance rates for PRs, which it's valid. We're not really trying to push PRs to get merged in a certain amount of time, But if I'm going to contribute the first time, like I want to walk in just like I'm going to walk into the barbecue spot. I think it's called the Pit around the back this afternoon. See you there. I'm going to look at a Yelp review before I walk in. I'm not trying to do reviews for projects, but I just want to give people a fighting chance to get involved in a community. And if there are communities that have really good infrastructure and a really good organization or a maintainer team, I want to point people to that. So I spent my entire time working on open source trying to find good projects to work on. Now I'm reaching out to projects and trying to set them up for success. So real quick, not only can we show contribution distribution of PRs, but we also see down to the contributor level. So we're going to be doing some pretty cool things early next year around individual contributors and profiles to identify where they're making contributions so other people could follow along and then also maybe make contributions on places that are onboarding contributors pretty well. So this slide meant to be earlier, but contribution distribution. And this is also like, I spent the last 4.5 years working at GitHub and identifying like, there's an insights tab on GitHub, but it's pretty underwhelming, to be quite honest. Shout out to GitHub, but it is pretty underwhelming. I could see who's contributing to the project, but it could have been someone contributing from years ago. I know the Redis project, which I know they have representation. I know their creator and main maintainer left the project last year. I don't know that as a new contributor. I know Redis. I know I can walk into the contributor graph and see them, but I don't know that if I should reach out to them and email them, or should I email somebody else in the project. There's not really a good onboard path into reaching out and saying, hey, I can help. And the sad part is like a lot of folks have years in the experience and can't do open source because they don't know where to start. So the contributor graph, I don't know if everybody knows this, but you can actually zoom in specifically to a certain section inside of GitHub to see where contributions are. So that one's for free. But this is currently the Vite project. Vite is a build tool in the JavaScript ecosystem. I'm able to narrow down to see where contributions are specifically. And if I see someone who's making lots of contributions, I have an opportunity to reach out in the Discord because they have a Discord to have that conversation. But this all insights on GitHub, having orange blobs and seeing like where activity looks like, I've always wanted to see a deeper dive and a deeper level into what's happening. So currently in open source, like our chart that I showed earlier, it's all based on 30 days of activity. By default, we'll probably do more deep dives in the future based on infrastructure costs. But I'm looking at the Next.js project right now, and I want to see like contributions within the last 30 days. And something that I always see is something which is called bus factor. The bus factor being if you got on a bus and you never came back, how detrimental that'd be for the project. And consistently, I see this in a lot of projects. You'll see a lot of performance upgrades. You'll see a lot of transfers from Webpack to Vite or something similar, where they touch a lot of files. And that becomes something that whenever I was managing at GitHub, whenever I see that, it becomes an opportunity for me to say, hey, thanks so much for your contribution, but could you also do docs along with that? Or, hey, you're doing a lot of work here. Do you think you could spread the wealth or spread the contributions to other folks? So my intent here is I want to give a fighting chance to anybody who walks in the project to say, hey, you know what, this person's like crushing it. Maybe not the best mentor, but maybe this person can help mentor through docs or mentor through a quick call or maybe recorded content. So I'm setting up this whole infrastructure to basically to have that question for anybody to walk to any project and do this. The other thing I want to mention is that we have currently file level changes. So it's hard to find out who the maintainer or who's the owner of the project. And we want to be able to generate code owners by default for any project based on contribution. And I also want to point out that this is based on code contributions. I do understand that there's non-code contributions. That's a larger problem and a larger thing to, like we're a very small team. So we'll get there eventually, but currently we're working on code contributions. So I'll sort of skim through this a bit to get to the end. But I just wanted to just bring up, having context and contributions gives everyone a leg up. Like it gives everyone a leg up to be able to understand like what's happening, where churn is happening. A lot of times you get contributors. So Matt's a contributor who's been, he got his first full-time React job through contributions to open source. He hasn't contributed a lot since because I think it's also, it's valid to be able to roll off of a project. Like I'm super proud of what he's contributed into the project I've been working on, but he also got an awesome job at SRS here in Raleigh. So I think he needs to focus on that and grow his career and become that senior dev, the staff engineer, and he can always come back and hang out. Which I'm looking forward to hang out with Matt tonight. But so what I'm getting at is like getting an idea of like contributions between not just the orange blob on GitHub, but actually seeing what PRs are changed. you get a good understanding of what's happening in the project. So look forward to sharing more about this in the future. The other thing I wanted to point out is the context. We're doing like some heuristics to find out changes, whether they're new features, maintenance changes, or I'm blanking, refactoring as well. Like these are all different types of changes that take different types of skill set. So someone who could touch 20 files in one PR is a different person than can write tests for the project. Maybe it's the same person, but it's a different skill set that folks can develop in different areas. So depending on the need of the project, you might need some refactoring. You might need some end-to-end testing. I highly recommend approaching it that way. So at the end of the day, like I think we should evolve. I think most of us are evolving past the green square thing. We can be more than green squares. We can be more to basically invite other folks into the industry and give them a pathway and a fighting chance to make their first contribution. So I would love to talk more about this. Find me around. Actually, I'm giving a talk in the afternoon on GitHub Actions and how we automate this process. So automating deployments and also how we crawl GitHub as well. We're using GitHub Actions as well. So definitely hit us up. Also, if you're interested in finding out how other people got their first contribution in industry or how they founded a company on open source, I've been doing this podcast called The Secret Sauce, where I've specifically been reaching out to folks. So Catherine got her job at GitHub because of an open source project. Catherine's all the way on the right. Built an open source project post bootcamp, and that open source project got tweeted out by GitHub once we found out. So it was my team that tweeted it out. And then within a week, she had an interview with the director of engineering at GitHub. So past performance is not predictor of future growth, but I think that putting yourself out there and doing open source and being involved in the community is a really good way to get a leg up. Cool, so that's all my slides, the Beyonce of open source, and thank you so much for listening, and stay saucy.